Lately, it feels like we're seeing a growing fascination with traditional womanhood. From the tradwife trend to romanticized images of pioneer life, social media often paints the past as simpler, slower, and somehow better. But was it? What did life actually look like for the women who came before us? Those women raised large families without modern conveniences, carried the invisible mental load, and had little choice over the lives they lived. In this episode, I'm joined by award-winning Canadian author Lise Mayne, whose novel Time Enough is inspired by the lives of pioneer women in Western Canada. Our conversation goes far beyond historical fiction. We talk about the invisible work women have always carried, why we're so drawn to nostalgic versions of the past, what the tradwife movement gets wrong about history, and the legacy our mothers and grandmothers leave us. This is a conversation about honoring the women before us without romanticizing their struggles, and about asking what parts of that legacy we want to carry forward and what we're finally ready to leave behind. Let's get into it. I'm Camille, and this is Kind of Bold. Liz, your book Time Enough takes us into the daily realities of pioneer women in the early 20th century, showing how much women had to carry to keep their families going when they had very few choices. Your main character is Euphemia, and while her husband works outside the home, she's effectively managing an entire operation, right? She's organizing the household, the travel, the children, the food, the logistics. I mean, it's insane. And often even everyone else's emotions. And at one point she says, I'm expected to think of everything and no one gives a toss about me. Somehow, this line still feels very relevant today. So have we really changed that much when it comes to the mental load that women carry?
I don't think so. I think that we carry so much. I see it in my daughter, who's 40. She's got 2 children. I see it in her. It's exhausting. And she's not working full time. I was a full-time teacher and principal while we were raising her. And my husband was going to university. And, it was so hard. And we only had 1. She has 2. She says, how did people do it when they had 5 or 6? My grandmothers, each one of my grandmothers, one had 8, one had 6. In my first novel, Becoming Sand, I described that for my French-Canadian grandmother, the same. Her husband was on the Canadian Pacific Railway, and he was gone all the time, and she had to do everything herself on a homestead. My other grandmother, the one in Time Enough, which is portrayed loosely, she also, especially when they got to the homestead, she had to do everything in the home, and they had to make all their own clothes. They had to make all their own food. 3 of her children were delivered by my grandfather. It was incredible what they had to go through. But the young women today, I see it in my daughter. She's got all the lessons to organize. She's got all the meals to organize. She's got to buy all the food, make sure the house is clean, take them to all their lessons. It is really, really demanding. And a lot of women are doing that as well as working full-time or part-time as well.
And it's incredible how that work was completely invisible to people around those women, right? I don't know if it's because it was sort of expected, but they were working in the background. They were getting themselves completely burnt out and no one was paying attention.
No one was paying.
Right? In the book, you mentioned many times how Euphemia is exhausted during the trip to America. And yes, there are moments when her boys, try to look after her and express a little bit of sympathy, but it was just all part of the life.
And I observed that in my mother and I observed that in my grandmothers, but I also did research about pioneer women. And I read a really excellent book, and it's called Dear Editor and Friends. And this woman has taken all of the old letters that were sent by pioneer women to the Western producer during the 1930s begging for help because there was no social safety net. And they are describing how they are having to live and survive. And they have no food, they have no work, their husbands are depressed and disengaged, and they're begging for help. And that's what they had to do finally, is to beg for help. But there was so much shame involved in that. And then they get criticized. People write in and say, how dare you ask for help? You're supposed to be strong. And you're supposed to be strong and resilient. These are all real letters. And so you realize that they're on their own. And I remember even my mom saying that her mother said to her, "You've made your bed, now you lie in it." It's hard. She had 3 children, all in diapers, by the age of 23. Boom, 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 one after the other. Yeah, and that's what I see in people giving this beautiful image of pioneer life when it's so false, because pioneer life was basic survival every single day.
There's this tradwife movement that often romanticizes a return to traditional femininity. And as someone who has spent years researching women's lives, what do you make of that trend?
Oh, literally, it makes me feel ill. Just think, if you had only done your research like I had, if you had only listened and talked to some of these women that are still alive and how they had to live, they had no help, nothing. There was, they're talking against vaccines. Many of them, their children died. People in my family died. People in my family got polio. What are you talking about? And you sit on your cell phone and you're like talking and it's all wonderful. And I can make a trad life and I can drink unpasteurized milk. And it's just like a lack of complete understanding. And it's a lack of honor for me. That's why it hurts me so badly, because it's a lack of honor for what those women actually achieved. I'd like to see these women actually sit down and do the work that is required. My French-Canadian grandmother had 15 children, 8 sons. And most of those men went off and went to Alberta to become pioneers. They all survived except one. So she did that all herself. And I've got her pictures of her wedding, and I've got her pictures when she was an older woman. And you can see it right in her face, what she went through.
So I guess there's a difference between choosing domesticity and having domesticity imposed upon you, right? Like those women today that portray this type of life on social media, they're making the choice to do that. Whereas those pioneer women, they had no choice.
And they were a big family, so they had to find a man. They had to find someone to support them. One of my aunties of that family of 15 was given to the church because they couldn't feed her. So they had to give her to the church, and she was a nun for over 50 years in Quebec. That's what they had to do. They had to orphan their children out. My own mother was offered during the 1930s. Someone came to their home and asked if they could take my mother to orphan her. And my grandparents refused, but a lot of people were giving their children away because they couldn't feed them. Yes.
No way.
So, and that's in Canada. That's Saskatchewan. Yep. And these are real, true stories.
Why do you think the fascination for
traditional life,
that kind of lifestyle?
Well, it's kind of like I remember on when we were young, the show Little House on the Prairie. And at that time, the external world was putting a lot of pressure on people. So everything went back to, Little House on the Prairie, the Waltons. And I don't know if you've noticed, but all the long skirts have come back. Oh, that's part of it. The long, long skirts. Yeah. That all happened during that time. The John Denver song, I got me own wife and I got me own fiddle. My cake's on the griddle. I like John Denver, but that song, I couldn't stand it because it's portraying a life that sounds like buoyant and happy and everything is wonderful. And if you actually dig beneath the surface, you would see how hard it was. You would see how cruel people were. My mother says everyone was cold as ice. People were cold. You never got a hug as a child. At Christmas, you got an orange maybe for Christmas and a pair of hand-knit mittens. Everything was hard and cold.
So, like, not just cold as it was cold in the house, but there was not a whole lot of open expression of love and affection. And
I think partly is because your children were considered as a commodity in a lot of ways. Of course, because they were there to help you on the farm, and they started working very, very young, very early. And also that just the fact that you or yourself, to get through this, you have to harden your heart. You have to harden yourself inside to be tough and strong and resilient. And if you're, soft and wonderful and kind and loving to your children, and then one of them dies of diphtheria, are you going to be able to get out of bed? Are you going to be able to survive and feed these children? And Euphemia talks about that in the book. She talks about that. She says, how am I going to do this without the support of my mother-in-law? Because I've never done this alone. And then she starts turning hard. In the book, she starts smacking the kids, right? And she becomes a really tough mother. And she said, they have to mind me. If they don't mind, then things will fall apart. And so the discipline was harsh. The lack of food, people were on the edge of starvation a lot of the time. And for people to romanticize this, I think a lot of it does refer to the fact that we're facing so much pressure, the pressures of climate change, the pressures of war, the pressures of the economy. And so therefore people think, oh, things were better in the old days. They were so much nicer. Everyone knew their role and they knew their place and they knew how to survive. And we're completely confused and lost. So let's go back. But you can't go back.
There's a critical underestimating of the burden that was on those women at that time. Would you be able to walk us through what the life looked like at the time? So from the moment a woman in the early 20th century woke up to the moment she would go to bed, let's just picture that she has 7, 8 children. What would that look like?
That would look very difficult. And I am so fortunate that I had opportunities to actually live with my grandparents, the ones that were pioneers. And in their home, they had the old stove, they had an old wringer washer, they had the garden, and they were still basically living those kind of routines, even though they were very old, because that was been sort of bred in the bone by this time. So they would get up first thing in the morning, and the woman would have to start the stove. She would have to get the food started right away. So start a porridge right away, get the coffee on if they had coffee. And meanwhile, the husband would have to get up right away. It could be 5, 6 in the morning, rain or shine, winter, summer, fall, and go outside and start looking after the animals. No one would eat in first thing when they got up. They would have to just go straight out to the animals and then come back in from the barn. The chores could take over an hour, and then they would come in and then they would sit down and eat. Meanwhile, the children would start getting up. The woman would be looking after them, feeding the baby. She might be breastfeeding, just a plethora of things that would have to be done to look after that child. There would be, cloth diapers. This is something people never mention, all of the physical things that would have to be looked after for the children. Then they would have to be washed and dressed and made ready to go to school. If they, some of those kids went to school by sleigh or by horse and buggy, so they would have to get them all ready for that, and off they would go. And then the woman would be left alone at home with whatever younger children there would be. They would be milked to process to make into fresh milk and cream and butter. That would be essential. There would be chickens, so they would have eggs. If there was a farm and a garden, they would have to be out in the garden right away. There was a lot of pressure to get all the gardening done really quickly in the summer because the land had to be prepared, the seeds had to be put in, the soil had to be watered, and then everything had to be harvested, all done quickly within 3 months so that they would have food for the winter. Otherwise, they would starve. So they knew how to process that food. They knew how to can. I learned all this with my grandmother. My grandmother still had a treadle sewing machine, the old Singer sewing machine. So she would make all the clothes, everything that they wore, she made it. We can't even wrap our head around this. She made my grandfather heavy coats, and they didn't have patterns. She looked in the Sears catalog and made the patterns out of newspaper by drawing them on the floor. This is a woman with a grade 2 education. And made all the kids' clothes, including their underwear, out of flour sacks, everything. And then they would have to maybe go into town and buy some food and bring eggs to sell to gain ready cash. And then at night, everything was done by the coal oil lamp, so they didn't have electricity. So all that sewing, and Grandma would knit scarves, she knit mittens. They would knit all their winter warm clothing that they needed, do all the washing. So the washing was done once a week, all by hand. And then everything, even in my grandmother's house as well, they had these hangers that would hang up above the stove. And so there was always wet, damp clothes hanging up in the kitchen, because that's the only way they could dry things in the winter. But in the summer, they hung everything, all the clothes out to dry. We can't even fathom the physicalness of it, the physical strength that they had to have, and the endurance. And of course, then when the kids came home from school, they would have the evening chores to do. And then supper would have to be made, dishes would have to be done. And the kids would all have to, do some, maybe a little bit of homework, and they would have their chores to do. So they got one day off a week, and that was on Sunday, and they would go to church. And that was their routine day in, day out. They loved the winter. Grandma always said they loved the winter because the winter they finally got a break. They finally got to sit down.
Okay.
They finally got to sit down. And Grandma said,
I know, I'm just exhausted.
Listening to it, yeah.
To
I know. And I experienced it very vicariously, but I'm not even close because I was just there alone, not with a whole house full of children.
I finished reading the book yesteryear. That is a satire of the fantasy of going back in time to live a more traditional life. And the main character performs all the time as a tradwife on social media. She actually doesn't know how to be herself anymore. And then she goes back in time and she realizes that there's no way you could have performed there, right? Like you just had to do, and you just had to be, and you just had to survive.
I think it's almost like an erasure of women's roles in the fact that people are not actually acknowledging the true sacrifices that women made for us to be here. We're here thanks to them. We have grandmothers because of who we needed that support. And in the traditional Indigenous cultures, the grandmothers were there for that support. And now you're an older woman, you're invisible. You're just invisible. Nobody cares about you. Nobody gives you acknowledgement. You can't get a job. You dye your hair. You have to constantly put Botox fillers in your face to be accepted and pretend that you're 20 years younger. You wouldn't believe how many people I see that put their author picture, their author page. And I know these people, you know darn well.
And you can't recognize
they're
them.
not that age anymore. They're not that age.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's not that it's photoshopped. It's just that
it's a really old picture. You know, I made sure that my picture is me. That's me now. Yeah, that's me. 100% me now. And as I get older and as I change, and you have to be proud of that because we've survived. You know, for me, every wrinkle that I have is a laugh line and something that I've earned. And I loved my grandmother's beautiful face at over 80. I loved her face and all the stories it told. So that's what I feel about it. I mean, I'm not criticizing other people. They can do what they want. But for me, it feels like it's a cultural, it's like a have to. You know, people can make a choice, but especially if you're in a entertainment profession or those kind of professions, it's like you have to pretend you're 20 years younger to keep current or people will erase you.
I have some hope that things are changing just a little bit. I can see celebrities proudly showing their wrinkles and their beautiful faces as they age, because I completely agree with you. I'm only 42, and I think I am pretty blessed by genetics on that side, because my mom is 73, and you think that she's at least 15 years younger. And I've always looked younger than my age, but I'm starting to see creepy skin on my hand and, little wrinkles on my neck. And I'm trying to fight that feeling because I agree, there's nothing more beautiful than aging and becoming wiser. But we're just so conditioned by media. It's really sad, actually, but I hope this will change. So you talked about inheritance, and actually one of the ideas that stayed with me after reading your book is that we inherit from the women who came before us much more than genetics, right? We inherit beliefs, coping mechanisms, expectations, fears, strength. And what do you think women pass down to each other across generations that we rarely talk about?
I feel so close to my grandmothers. I feel their pull in my heart all the time. And I am trying to do the same for my grandchildren, is to give them the feeling of security, the feeling of, the book Time Enough says, all will be well in good time. That's what that saying means. So you have to believe like that all things must pass and that you have the resiliency within you. You have the courage. You have the power within you. I've survived through so many things. I've survived health challenges, career challenges, and I'm really tough and resilient inside. And I think that I gained that from those women that came before me.
I never really had a close relationship with my grandparents. I can imagine how valuable that must be to be close to your grandma and then kind of showing you the way. I've never quite had that. I was fortunate to have a mother, to still have a mother, who's very self-aware, progressive, who've always told me to work hard, not depend on a man. Yeah, just carve out path for myself. So I guess that kind of wisdom came from her.
And many people now, because of the fact that most women are having children older, that is going to be the case, sadly, because you see what I mean?
Good point.
that's the negative part of it.
It's true that my mom wasn't very young when she had, well, there was my sister first, but she was already in her 30s, which at the time was a little bit later than her friends. So that's true. Yeah. And my grandparents died pretty young too. So I never got to know them that well.
You see, so that's the kicker. But you know what? The other thing is that I have also nurtured many relationships with older women in my life. I have kept those relationships my whole life. One of my dearest friends is, we've been friends for 48 years, since I was 20. So I couldn't have any more children after I had my first. And I wanted a big family, but I couldn't have any more children. And I was just devastated. And I couldn't get over it. And I had a really good gynecologist who said to me, Lise, there are many ways to be a mother. That was such good advice. And it stopped me in my tracks because I was a teacher, of course. And I thought, well, yes, I'll be the best mother I can. And it's the same with grandmother, right? So there are many ways to have a grandmother or to attract and be with someone who is an elder. Because not necessarily like I had two grandmothers. One of them was not my favorite person in the world. She was very mean and she didn't like me, but my other grandmother wasn't. So it's not necessarily that just because it's a grandmother, they're nice. But if you also nurture other people, like my daughter is doing that with some of her elderly friends, they're becoming grandmothers to her children as well, because we live quite far away. And then those children have that opportunity to be with those elderly women, and they're teaching them things. You know, they're teaching them how to sew, or they're teaching them how to work in a garden, things like that. So it's not just one person that can be your true grandmother.
I want to go back to that mean grandmother. What are some of the lessons that you learned from her? Like, how do we honor the women that came before us while still choosing a different path? So I assume that you chose a different path from her.
Yeah. She was not as engaged with her children. She was very, very bossy. And she had expectations that they would become certain things. So she, like, for example, she wanted my dad to be a priest. And he was going to be a priest. And that was it. And then he decided not to. So, you know, she had a role for each person. And many of her children ran away from home, or they ended up very dysfunctional. Her whole family. That's what I wrote about in my first book, Becoming Sand. They became very disengaged from their culture. They very disengaged from their language, and they became very disengaged in their family. And that is something I did not want. I wanted to create a good family. And that has been my big goal throughout my life, and I've done it.
When we talk about family legacy, do you think we're also inheriting the dreams our mothers and grandmothers never got to pursue?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do. My grandmother did tell me that because she wanted to be a teacher. The one that I loved. She said I wanted to be a teacher. So she was so proud of me when I got my teaching degree because she wanted to be a teacher. And she never, of course, had that chance. She was a pioneer woman and with 6 children on the Bald Prairie. And she had grade 2 education. So for her to see her grandchild graduate from university, it was like a dream come true. I used to say, we always want to see those children do better than we did. And I said, even for me, when I was working with young teacher, I say, I want you to be a better teacher than I was. One thing I love so much about the Native culture is the 7 generations. Every decision that they would make would be based on how will this impact 7 generations from now.
You know what? I asked you that question. At the same time, I thought about how I've always been very career driven. I mentioned earlier that my mom always encouraged me to work hard and be financially independent from a man. But that is also because she didn't have that. She was working a really good job when my sister got sick. It was in the late 70s. At the time, it was not a thing for fathers to stay home, right? So my mom was the one who quit her job, her well-paying job. She was making more money than my dad. And that is one of her deepest regrets. Of course, she took care of my sister and that's what she wanted to do. And she doesn't regret that part. But then her career was over in an instant. And so it makes me wonder, you know, did I carry this over? Did I, pick up the torch subconsciously?
Yes, I think so. I do believe that. I think there's a lot of genetic pull as well. Like, we don't know that the genetics are there, but there's a genetic pull to certain things, to certain ways. I see it in my grandchildren, each one, because I only had one child. So I never really saw it as closely as I do now with my grandchildren, how each one is so different. And they're pulling from different sides of the family. And
what's even harder is not that any of this is intentional or conscious even, is breaking the cycle, right? Because we talked about carrying over some of those dreams and desires, but when you know deep down that it needs to stop with you.
Yes, it needs to stop with you. And we know more. And Maya Angelou, I love what she said. One of her sayings is, when you know better, you do better. So you don't reprimand yourself for the mistakes that you made because you didn't know better. But when you know better, you must do better.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, you can follow wherever you get your podcasts or share it with someone who might need to hear it too. Until next time, be bold, be kind, and don't apologize for holding both. I'm Camille, and this was Kind of Bold.